big finale.
Welcome back to the big finale. I'm Bruce Collins. We hope you've been enjoying the big finale. For those of you keeping score at home, this, of course, is episode 7 of the big finale. Now, before we get into the interview this week with our very special guest, we want to tell you that, for those of you who may not know, there's a second program that we do every week called The Bruce Collins Show. Now, the Bruce Collins Show is kind of our main program. It airs on AM radio in the Tampa, Bradenton, Sarasota, Florida area, Thursday nights at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on that radio station, WWPR 1490 AM. And you can listen online at 1490wwpr.com. And then it also airs on IPBN-FM.com Friday nights at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And then you can also find it in other places like Fringe Radio Network. And we have a YouTube channel for the Bruce Collins Show. So I wanted to let you guys know that if you're not aware of that, we do have a second program every week called the Bruce Collins Show. But you're here and you're listening to the big finale. And we think so far we've had a very interesting, unique show where we occasionally bring on a round table, and then we also have some of the best guests out there to talk about weird stuff, strange stuff, bizarre stuff. And tonight is no exception. Our guest is author Thomas J. Carey. Now, I've interviewed Thomas J. Carey twice before, once for an anthology book, and another time for his book Inside the Real Area 51 that he co-wrote with Donald Schmitt. Now, that was a great book. But this is another great book, the latest book, which is The Children of Roswell. I think you're going to enjoy this. It's a very action page-turner book, and I think it really comes out in the interview. And we ask a little bit of tough questions. For instance, if there really is a cover-up, how come everybody knows about Roswell? Which is my main question. So here we go with that interview. Thomas J. Carey, the big finale, episode 7. Buckle up for the ride. And joining us this week, it's my honor to welcome Thomas J. Carey. Thomas J. Carey holds a master's degree in anthropology and is a U.S. Air Force veteran who held a top-secret security clearance. He has spent the last 25 years investigating the Roswell incident and published more than 40 articles about it. Tom has appeared as a guest on many radio and TV shows and contributed to a number of Roswell-related documentaries. Tom Carey and Donald Schmitt authored the excellent book Inside the Real Area 51, The Secret History of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and I had the pleasure of interviewing both gentlemen about that book. Now, Tom returns with a new book he also co-authored with Donald Schmitt called The Children of Roswell, a 7-decade legacy of fear, intimidation, and cover-ups. Thomas Carey, welcome back to the program.
Nice to be with you again, Bruce. How are you?
I'm doing well, and it's great to have you back. And this is another excellent bombshell book. Now, before we talk about your exciting new book, The Children of Roswell, that as I said before, you co-authored with Donald Schmitt, I wonder if you can take us back to the time period where you became convinced that UFOs were real, and it set you on this course. I would love to hear that it was when you had top secret security clearance, but I suspect maybe not. How did this happen, though?
No, when I had top secret security clearance, I had never heard of the Roswell incident. But I'll tell you how I became convinced about the subject of UFOs, that some of the UFOs were actually extraterrestrial vehicles. In the 1950s and early 1960s, I read a couple of books by Donald E. Kehoe, the first advocate for the subject that UFOs are real. That was his thing, and he wrote several books: Flying Saucers from Outer Space, Flying Saucers, the UFO Conspiracy. He was a terrific writer and a terrific advocate during the 1950s and early 60s. Well, then, after his book, that got me interested in the subject. After his book, I read a book by the former head of Project Blue Book, Captain Edward Ruppelt, called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. And if anybody knew if UFOs were real or not, he should, as the head of Project Blue Book. And his book was convincing, and it was convincing that UFOs were real. His position was that there was a lot of chicanery going on in the background, but his conclusion was that the UFOs were real objects. Mm-hmm. Well, after that book, which came out, I think, in 1955, they made a movie of it, just called UFO, and it was a docudrama, and it was also very good. But after that, UFOs, the subject seemed to die away. It seemed to die away until the mid-1960s. So we had a period, at least for me, of almost 10 years where there was basically nothing going on. And in 1966, I read a book by I don't know which, a journalist, mostly of the paranormal, named Frank Edwards, mm-hmm. called Flying Saucers Serious Business. And it was, flying saucers are back, and it's serious business. So that sort of rekindled my interest. By that time, I was already a believer. But in 1980, a book came out called The Roswell Incident by William Moore and Charles Berlitz. And I said, oh my goodness, this is a book not about just lights in the sky and radar targets and people telling stories of strange goings on. It was a story about a crashed flying saucer that left wreckage, physical wreckage, little bodies. There was a government cover-up. Witnesses were threatened. It had everything. It had everything. And that book just blew me away. I was already a believer that UFOs, some of them at least, were extraterrestrial craft and crew. But this book convinced me that at least one had crashed, and that it was somewhere within our government grasp, probably at some remote location, who knows, but and there were little bodies that we also had recovered. So that book blew me away, and it really focused my attention strictly on this one case. I don't care so much about any other case, and I've been actively investigating this case for the last 25 years, Bruce. For the last 25 years, I've concentrated on this case alone. And since 1998, I've teamed with Don Schmidt, because if you remember, the 50th anniversary year of 1997 of the Roswell event from 1947 was sort of the high watermark for interest in this case. But after that year, interest, at least amongst the investigators, seemed to wane, and they went on to do different things. But Don and I wanted to continue a proactive, and I underline that word, proactive investigation of the case. Now, what do I mean by that? That means that we're just not sitting back in our offices or in our easy chair waiting for someone to come along and say, hey, interview me. Here I am. That's never going to happen. We're out there shaking the tree every day to see if we can find new witnesses and maybe stir up something, some information, or perhaps even a piece of physical evidence that we haven't had before. So that's what we've been doing since 1998, and I guess in 2 years we will have been a team for 20 years, which in any situation is a long time.
Yeah. Now, this book in particular, this is an excellent book, The Children of Roswell, and I see that you've got a lot of stories about intimidation and fear mongering and cover-ups. Is that what makes this book unique from other books that have been written about Roswell?
Yes. What makes this book unique is that in the other books about Roswell, including our first three, the Children of Roswell is our fourth book as a team about the Roswell incident. The previous books were about what happened, where did it happen, when did it happen, who was involved. Well, this book concentrates on, of course we have to set the framework, but it concentrates on the children and the grandchildren of the actual participants who were involved in the crash recovery. Because, number one, the participants are basically all gone now. They've all passed away, except for a scant few, and who we're unaware of. I'm sure there's still others out there that were participants, but look at it this way, Bruce. If you were 20 years old in 1947, next year you will be 90 years old. Mm-hmm. So that gives you some idea of the age of the case, with the people passing away. And we're getting, even when they were still alive, we were still getting a lot of information from the children and the grandchildren. Now, I have to tell you, even the children now are passing away. Very few left that were actually children at the time, but most of the ones we were talking to were not born yet at the time of the Roswell incident, but they got the information from their father and or their mother or some other relative about the event. And so they're willing to talk to us, where oftentimes the actual participant would not talk to us. Mm-hmm. So the other thing we do is that we do a lot of what they call character development. We give a lot of the background of the person we're talking to and what the context is and was regarding how they handled the so-called the oral history of this event in their family. Some people got really spooked out, others handled it well and just continued on with their lives. But the reactions were varied. It ranged from bitterness to making a joke out of it to well, I still don't want to talk. The whole panoply of reactions. But that's what we concentrate on. How did this event affect the families that were involved, and how did it, especially the children, because the adults are no longer around, and grandchildren?
Mm-hmm. Now, I suspect most people have heard the Roswell story, but maybe for those who have not, if we could maybe briefly touch on what happened on June 14, 1947. But in addition to that, here's another interesting thought, I think. Wait a
minute. June 14th, nothing happened.
Oh, it was, when was it then?
Well, the ship crashed late in the evening of July the 2nd. 1947. The June 14th date, Bruce, you get from the Air Force story, which is a joke. Excuse my resorting to that pejorative, but the Air Force story claims that it's the Project Mogul explanation, the Weather Balloon Plus explanation. They claim that it was launched on June the 4th, and that the rancher Mac Brazel found it on June 14th, 10 days later. Well, that's all hokum. That's bogus. The real story occurred with an explosion late in the evening during a thunder and lightning storm near Corona, New Mexico, that destroyed what we believe was a flying disc, flying saucer, whatever you want to call it, UFO. It exploded. Several bodies were thrown out. Several occupants were thrown out right away. Came to rest about 2.5 miles from the so-called debris field where all of the wreckage came down, except the inner cabin. The inner cabin withstood the explosion and continued on for another 35 miles and came to rest about 30 miles north of the town of Roswell. So we actually have 3 sites involved in this. The debris field site up near Corona, where the thing actually exploded in the air during a thunder and lightning storm, and it rained down all these little pieces of metal down in a sheep pasture on a ranch that was run by a foreman named Mac Brazel. Without Brazel finding that stuff the next day, we're not talking here tonight, because he went into town, into Roswell, and reported all this. So if the Air Force had gotten there first, we never would have, we wouldn't be talking tonight, and none of us would have known about this. So the second site's 2.5 miles east of that, where these 2 bodies came down and met their fate on a low bluff, 2.5 miles east of the debris field site, still up near Corona in Lincoln County. The third site is 35 miles southeast of these 2 sites, where the inner cabin came to rest just north of Roswell. Inside were 2 more dead bodies, 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with large heads, and 1 that was still alive. So there were a total of 5 bodies altogether, 4 dead, 1 still alive at the time it was discovered. Now the story, Brazel goes into town on Sunday, July the 6th. He reports it to the sheriff. The sheriff calls the base, the air base, the Roswell Army Airfield south of town about this, and they send out the intelligence officer to see what sort of wreckage Brazel brought in. It was sufficiently exotic that Brazel took it back to his commanding officer, who said, "Get out there, see what we got, take whatever you need with you." And according to Jesse, the intelligence officer was Jesse Marcel, Major Jesse Marcel. Without Marcel, we have no Roswell story that you and I would be talking about tonight. Because the next day, he comes back to the base at Roswell, but he stops off at home before he goes to the base to show it to his wife and son, Jesse Jr. And from Jesse Jr., who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago, we learned that his father believed, even at that early point in the case, that it was a flying saucer. He said, "I believe this is a flying saucer. It's nothing we made." He said it came to Earth, but it was not from the Earth. That was his position. So, to try to summarize this, the base immediately puts out a press release that the base had come into possession of a crashed or downed flying saucer. That's the term they use, flying saucer. And once it hit the AP wire, the story went around the world and just went real fast around the world, all the way to China. And so the base started getting phone calls from all over the world. What do you got there? What tell us more, tell us more. So the Air Force decided at that point, we don't know what this is, We don't want to panic on our hands. We got to kill this story. So they, on the very next day, July 9, 1947, that they held a press conference and said that was a weather balloon, not a crashed flying saucer. It was, after all, it was a weather balloon. The men at the 509th Bomb Group in Roswell just misidentified a bunch of tinfoil, neoprene rubber, balsa wood sticks, and baling twine for an interplanetary spacecraft. Now, that you have to, that is a leap. That's a bridge too far for me. Mm-hmm. But you have to think, and most of the people didn't know this, but the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell, this was the group that ended World War II by dropping 2 bombs on Japan. Their bomb group was created solely to deliver the atomic bomb. It's still in existence today, and its mission is still to deliver atomic weapons. It's based in Missouri now, but back then it was at the Roswell Army Airfield, just south of town. And I don't know about you, but if I have a group that has their fingers on the atomic trigger that can't tell the difference between balsa wood, tinfoil, rubber, and baling twine in an interplanetary spaceship, we have a problem.
Yes. Houston, we have a problem. And I just want to say, for the record, even though I said June 14th, I am not a disinformation agent. Now, Tom.
Well, that's where that date comes from. It's the Air Force story.
You know, this is an interesting question, though, in regards to the Air Force and the military's activity in New Mexico, and also all of the UFO incidents at that time in New Mexico. What was, in your opinion, what was going on that was causing these two things to converge? Because a skeptic might say, well, maybe these UFO were government craft, and that because the military was there. What do you think was actually going on back then that all of this activity was happening in New Mexico?
Well, we can only speculate. Number one, on the crash, either it was an internal explosion or an external, something external like thunder and lightning that caused the ship to explode. But what was going on in New Mexico? If I'm a Martian, and that's what they called them back in the 40s, they weren't extraterrestrials or EBEs or anything. They called them Martians. Mm-hmm. If I'm a Martian and I'm about to take a trip to our nearest planet, I'm going to zero in on New Mexico because that's where all the high-tech stuff is going on. You've got the atomic laboratories at Sandia. You got the atomic laboratories at Los Alamos that created the atomic bomb. You've got the V-2 rockets being tested that they captured from the Germans in World War II. You have they're still testing atomic bombs, and I'm sure I'm leaving stuff out. You have the only atomic bomb group, or the only unit in the world with atomic weapons at Roswell. So you have all of this scientific stuff and military stuff going on in the state of New Mexico at the time, and I'm sure I'm leaving something out. So that's where I'm going to zero in.
Yeah,
is New Mexico, and in fact, New Mexico was having of all of the flying saucer reports that were taking place, because the modern age of flying saucers only started 2 weeks prior with the Kenneth Arnold sighting in upstate Seattle on June 24th. So the age of flying saucers was only two weeks old, and then you have the Roswell incident. So, but New Mexico had more sightings than any other state.
Yeah.
Now, so, but we don't know, Bruce, why, but using speculation, that would be my speculation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, the subtitle of your book, The Children of Roswell, is a 7-decade legacy of fear, intimidation, and cover-ups. Again, written by Tom Carey and Donald Schmidt, another great book by this duo. Can you tell us about the initial treatment of the farmers by the Air Force and a man named Hunter Penn?
I always get him mixed up with, I want to say Hunter Pence, who used to play right field for the Phillies here. I think he plays for San Francisco now, but it's Hunter Penn. But that's a little joke here. So, but anyway, the treatment was, today it would be called, oh my goodness,
harassment?
More than that, they would be called, civil crimes. They would be, the military has only dominance over the civilians either in time of war or in time of martial law, which is used in extreme emergencies. And that's not what we had here in the Roswell case. Were civil rights violations. That's what I was looking for. These were definite civil rights violations in that you had military taking over the town basically for a couple of days and threatening people who knew about the crash or who were at one of the crash sites, and especially those who saw or knew about the little bodies. Now, they used the sheriff of Chavez County, Sheriff George Wilcox, to deliver the message to the local Hispanic witnesses because Wilcox was fluent in Spanish. So they used him to deliver the message to the local Hispanics who knew about the crash, were at the crash site, and or knew about the bodies. And he would just drive around to their house, and they say, geez, I wonder what the sheriff wants with us. We didn't do anything. And he would come in and say, if you ever talk about this, not only will we kill you, but we will kill your children. And that happened to a number of families that we interviewed. So, for the non-Hispanic citizens of Roswell, they used a first lieutenant by the name of Arthur Philbin. Now, he was the base liaison to Roswell for when they would have a military exercise in town, for whatever reason, Philbin would go in and coordinate with the police department, the sheriff's department, whoever was in charge there, the city manager, to organize things so the military presence would would proceed with seamlessly, would proceed very nicely. But the thing was, they used him also to deliver the death threats to non-Hispanic civilians in Roswell who knew about the crash or the bodies, or who had been at the crash site, but who especially knew about the bodies. They used him. Now, for the outside ranchers, because in remote New Mexico like that, especially you have an air base there, there are occasional crashes of aircraft, whether it's a light plane or something bigger, they have crashes. And the civilian ranchers are always the first ones to the crash site, always, because they're out there. And it's almost like a family occasion. The father would go, the mother would go, and the children would also go. So they'd all go out there. Number one, to see if anybody was still alive or injured that they could help. But they would always make off with souvenirs when they went back home. So we have a number of civilians who got out there who also saw the wreckage, saw the bodies. So they had to be dealt with, just like the citizens in Roswell. So they sent this fellow from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, or Wright Field at the time. He had been a member of the Hells Angels B-17 bomb group, part of the 8th Air Force in Europe during World War II, called the Hells Angels. So this was a Rock'em Sock'em outfit, and he was a bombardier in one of the B-17s. Now, I did a little research on his record, and it turns out that this feller Hunter Penn, he was withdrawn from flight status after only 2 missions. So I don't know what he did, but they deemed him unfit for flight status after only 2 missions. Well, he winds up at right field, and he's one of these guys that break glass and use him only in time of emergency. And this was an emergency. We interviewed his daughter, and she said that he was brutal. He was brutal to her and to her mother. And she told us about his activities, that he had mentioned to her that in 1947 he was sent to interview the ranchers outside of Roswell who knew about the UFO crash. And he was sent there to enforce their silence. And he was authorized to use physical force if necessary. And his daughter said that he was fond of ice picks, what you used to chop ice, blocks of ice, these ice picks. She said he was fond of those, and she thinks he might have used one at Roswell. But he was sent around to enforce the silence of the ranchers and to use whatever means necessary to see that was accomplished. And that was Hunter Penn. He died some time ago, so we never got to interview him. But he sounds like he was like a colonel. He wasn't like a sergeant or anything. He was a colonel. So he had some value, but his value was in these types of situations.
Yeah. Now, your book, The Children of Roswell, you mentioned Barbara Dugar, whose grandmother Inez revealed something very important to her about 1947. What was it, and why was she hesitant to talk about it?
Well, Inez Wilcox, the surviving wife of George Wilcox, the sheriff of Chavez County, on the day of the moon landing. Now, this is July something or other, 1969. It's interesting, Bruce, that a lot of the people, the witnesses who had maintained their silence, for some reason, when they viewed this, remember the moon landing was on television.
Yeah.
When they saw this moon landing on television, it was like a catharsis to them, that they sort of opened up about their involvement in the Roswell crash of an extraterrestrial ship. And the moon landing had some effect on them. And such was the case with Inez Wilcox. Her and her husband, because I mentioned to you that her husband was used to deliver death threats. Well, when we found the Wilcox family, of course, George died in 1961, long before we ever heard of Roswell, and Inez died in 1978, and of course she was gone before we got involved. But she had told her granddaughter, Barbara Dugar, or Barbara Duggar, about what happened in 1947. They had kept it secret all those years because they had been threatened. Instead of getting a couple attaboys from the Air Force for doing a good job in the death threat department, the Air Force comes around one day and they rough up the sheriff, and they say, okay, now if you talk about this, you have to remain silent. If you talk, we're not only going to kill you and your wife, we're going to kill your children and grandchildren too. So how's that to tell the sheriff of Chavez County, who was a big help to you? Yeah. How's that for a nice reward? We're going to kill you if you don't remain silent. So Inez remained silent all those years until July of 1969, when they're watching Barbara Dugar or Barbara Duggar, either one's all right. She turns to Barbara, who was staying with her for a short period of time prior to her entering college as a freshman that year. And so she was staying with her grandmother, Inez, and Inez says, "Well, Barbara, do you believe in space? I'm sorry, in life out there in space?" And Barbara says, "Well, of course I do. Why do you ask?" So Inez, before she answers, she gets up from her chair. She goes over to the windows, shuts all the windows, closes all the blinds, locks all the doors, and sits back down in the chair and looks around to make sure there's nobody there other than Barbara. And she says, "Well, I'll tell you, Barbara, back in 1947, there was a crash of a flying saucer north of Roswell, and your grandfather was involved." And she went on and told her about the story, but especially she told Barbara about the death threats. And Barbara, listening to all this, she says, "Well, did you believe them about the death threats?" And she said, "What do you think?" In a stern way, like, of course. Mm-hmm. So Barbara, we get the story from her about all of the activities that went on with her grandparents. And that the family was basically horrified over the years. She had a cousin, this was the grandson of George Wilcox Jr. Now, he was 3 years old at the time of the Roswell incident. He's never been interviewed before, but we interviewed him for our book. And he was at the jailhouse. The jailhouse, the sheriff's office, and the sheriff's residence was all in the same building. So he was visiting his grandparents with his mother, who was one of Wilcox's daughters. So he witnessed all this as a 3-year-old. Now, you know yourself as a 3-year-old, you don't remember everything.
Right.
In adult life, he said, but it's strange, he said, I grew up with this irrational fear of UFOs, and I don't know why. I grew up with this fear of UFOs, and I don't know why. He didn't know why, but then he heard from the rest of the family what had transpired, and he said, "Oh my goodness, that's right. I was at the sheriff's office when they roughed up, Grandpa." And that was causing his fear. It was the fear of the Air Force, actually, which had to do with the UFO incident. But it was the fear of the Air Force that fostered this grandson's irrational fear all these years that he didn't quite know why. So, but we have a whole chapter on the Wilcox family in the book, and how the incident destroyed the sheriff. He never ran for sheriff again. And it's just a remarkable story.
Mm-hmm. Now, you have a part of your book that's about an interview that Donald Schmitt did in 1991. And on the phone with him was Frankie Rowe, and she started sobbing uncontrollably. What happened to her? Can you tell us her story?
Yes, Frankie Rowe was a child of Roswell. She was 12 years old at the time of the incident. She's still alive, and she's going on 80. She's either 81 or 82, but she's still alive, 12 years old in 1947. She had gone into town at the time of the incident to have some dental work done. Her father was a fireman for the Roswell City Fire Department. and the father had somehow gotten out to the crash site, either in an official capacity because he was a crew chief, and the firehouse did take a call that there had been a crash out there. But a colonel from the base and also the city manager both arrived at the firehouse to tell them not to go out there. That the firemen on the base, because they had their own fire department, the Air Force did, that they would handle it. But somehow Frankie's father, Dan Dwyer, got out there, either in his own vehicle on his own or in some special capacity for the city fire department. And he saw everything, the crash, but he focused on, once he saw the bodies, that was it. He forgot about the wreckage and concentrated on the bodies. And he also told about one of the occupants that was still alive and sort of struggling walking around the crash site. And he interacted with that, the one that was alive. So Frankie not only knew all of that from her father telling the story to the family when he got home, but she also went back to the firehouse after her dental visit, waiting for her father to drive her home. And while she's waiting there, in comes this highway patrolman with a strange piece of wreckage, piece of memory metal, which he shared with everybody, including Frankie. So Frankie not only knew about the bodies and the crash north of town, she also she handled some of the strange wreckage. So she herself, the next day, was threatened by this Arthur Philbin with her life. This is a 12-year-old, with her life and the life of her parents. They would all be taken out into the desert and left there, and nobody would even find their bones. So this is, on the mind of a 12-year-old. Well, she becomes an adult, so she never talks about this until the civilian investigation got going with us in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So Don Schmidt had interviewed her, and they were going to be on a radio show from Boston, I believe it was. And Don was in one room on an extension phone, and Frankie was in another room on another extension. So they're both on the phone to this radio announcer in Boston. And so he talks to Don, and Don gives him the background, et cetera, et cetera. And then he says, "Okay, Frankie, now regarding what happened to you, can you tell us what happened to you?" And there's no response. And Don hears this sobbing in the other room. What is going on here? So he goes in the room, and there's Frankie. She's hunched over, sobbing, just uncontrollably sobbing. "Frankie, what is it? What is it?" Well, it turned out that the voice of the host of that radio show reminded her of the voice of the officer who threatened her so many years before, and she just utterly lost it.
Wow.
He reminded her of that officer, and she carried that for years. And I can tell you, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but the story has a happy ending years later, actually 2 years ago. The story has a happy ending involving the son of that officer who had threatened her so many years before.
Wow. And that's in the book, right?
That's in the book,
okay.
Yes.
Now, what was Sergeant Melvin E. Brown privy to?
Melvin E. Brown was a staff sergeant in K Company. That's the K for kitchen. He was a cook at Roswell, the Roswell Air Base, but he had a top secret clearance, and he was trusted by the officers, the high officers on the base, because he had this high security clearance. And Melvin Brown had one of the early stories of seeing the bodies. I'd be hard pressed right now to come up with a name that had an earlier account of seeing the bodies than Melvin Brown. He was they called him over to the base hospital, and he was ordered into an ambulance. Now, he's a cook. What's he doing in an ambulance? He was ordered into an ambulance to accompany somebody on a drive in one of these box ambulances that the military, they have the big red cross on the side. Looks a lot like a troop carrier, but it's enclosed. So they drive out 30 miles north of town, and they pull off the road, and they're sitting there, and they start loading. They're told not to get out of the ambulance, just wait there. And so a couple airmen, they start carrying something in a couple things in a bag and load them into the back of the ambulance. Jeez. And then they covered it up with dry ice, with ice. Well, with ice. I don't know if it's dry ice or but ice. And my goodness, what is this? What are we doing here? And then they were ordered back, okay, drive back to the base hospital. So on the drive, and before they pulled out, they said, but no circumstances look under that tarpaulin. Well, yeah. Of course, that's the go-ahead for once you're out of range, the first thing you're going to do is look under there, right?
Right.
So Melvin Brown gets up and he goes in the back and he looks under the tarpaulin, and my goodness, there's a couple bodies, little bodies, but child size, 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with these large heads. And he goes, oh my God, what is this? Well, we know what they were, and he knew that they weren't human. But he kept this story all his life. He went on and of course, when they got to the hospital, they were unloaded, and the bodies went into the hospital, and Melvin Brown was sworn to, you never went out there. You're sworn to secrecy. Don't talk about this. You never left the base. So he kept this story all his life until the late 60s. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it was the same time as the moon landing or not, but it was about that time. And he's on his deathbed. And according to his daughter, Beverly Bean, his wife didn't want to talk about it, but after he said his goodbyes, he's on his deathbed. He was going in and out of consciousness, but all he was talking about was Roswell on his deathbed, 1947, and that there had been a special account set up in one of the Roswell banks for him for $10,000. Well, back in those days, $10,000 was a lot of money. And he was, going in and out of consciousness, in and out. And, but it was the mumbling, it was all about Roswell. Mm-hmm. And, the family, I remember his daughter, resentment and bitterness was her reaction to all of this. How dare they tell him to keep this story bottled up all these years until now he's on his deathbed and this is all he can talk about. And it turns out there was at least they could find no bank account with $10,000 or even an account with Melvin Brown's name. But he was one of the first witnesses about the bodies, and he had this deathbed confession that just startled the family, and their reaction was resentment and bitterness.
In your research, how many people would you say have come forward that you've considered credible who actually saw these alien bodies? And you don't have to have an exact figure, but estimate, is it 10 people, 20 people? How many people?
I'd have to do a count, but it's, that actually firsthand, you mean, or knew about the bodies?
Yeah, firsthand.
I'd say it's, somewhere around 10.
Wow. That's a pretty good number, actually.
Yeah. But it could be more, but I'd have to sit down and write down the names because, we have over 600 witnesses, first, second, and third hand on this case, and then they're all going around in my head. So
yeah.
I'd have to sit down and say, okay, which ones saw the bodies? Okay, Melvin Brown. There was that nurse. We believe we know who the nurse is. And there's so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. So I would say about 10.
Yeah. Now, because you are who you are and you're researching this, do you get a lot of people contacting you that you kind of have to disprove or not connect?
No. 95% of the witnesses that we have we found on our own.
I see.
Very, very few contact us either directly or through the museum in Roswell. Don Schmidt's he's an adjunct member of the board of directors of the Roswell UFO Museum. So suppose somebody comes into the museum, and again, the museum also has that cathartic effect on visitors that know something. You get into that museum, you see all the stuff about the craft, they want to open up about what they know. So we do get some through the museum, but not many because the numbers are dwindling on us, Bruce. The numbers are dwindling. And so I would say 95% or more we are witnesses that we have found, and very few are ones that contact us directly or through the museum ring.
Yeah. And in your book, The Children of Roswell, you and Donald Schmidt write, the search for physical evidence from the Roswell UFO crash of 1947 has been one of the most frustrating aspects of our quarter-century investigation of this case. Now, as your book points out, there were people who were rumored to have some of the wreckage. What has been the results of locating these rumored artifacts?
It's very frustrating, Bruce. All of them so far have either been a hoax, in which case, they must think we're dopes, because they'll call us up. So this is where we get back to the ones that call us first.
Yeah.
Once we start asking questions, I guess they think we'll just sit there with our mouths open. Oh, gee, gosh, tell me more, Yeah. So we start asking them a few questions, and they can't hang up fast enough. So then we call them back, and they don't answer the phone. So they run away. Other ones were told a story. Yes, we had a piece in our family. My father had it. Well, where is it? Can you? Well. We don't know what happened to it. It must be when we moved 3 moves ago. We moved here, then we moved there. Somewhere in the move, it got lost. Well, tell us where to look, and we'll look. No. Well, I'll look for it, and then we never hear from them again. It's very, very frustrating.
And again, I want to remind the listeners that the book is The Children of Roswell, a 7-decade legacy of fear, intimidation, and cover-ups by Thomas J. Carey and Donald R. Schmidt. I recommend this book. I've got a copy right here in my hands. Before we go, Tom, when we look at this and we talk about it as fear, intimidation, and cover-ups, can we say, since everyone knows about Roswell, that the cover-up failed?
No, it worked for 30 years.
Uh-huh.
It worked for 30 years.
Wow. This is a great book, The Children of Roswell, a 7-decade legacy of fear, intimidation, and cover-ups by Thomas J. Carey and Donald R. Schmidt. Thomas J. Carey. Tom, thank you so much for joining us this week.
It's been my pleasure, Bruce.